Okay, so now we have the label set up in the layout. So that was the main.storyboard. We did that simply by just kind of dragging and dropping it from the list of objects into the main.storyboard layout. Now we're going to add it to the code. So we've seen that we could modify the attributes by clicking on the label in the main.storyboard and then opening up the attributes window and editing things directly in there. This time we're going to add it into the code by dragging and dropping it from the main.storyboard, so from the layout, and then we'll see that we can actually modify it directly in the code by calling functions and attributes once it's been initialized. So the way we'll do this is we'll initialize it first by dragging and dropping it, and then we'll be able to call the name dot and then whatever we want to basically modify, whatever field or method we want to use to modify it. Right, now let's talk about how to modify this label's contents directly in the code itself. Okay, so previously we've looked at how to modify stuff using the attributes editor, and that will pop up if we select the label itself, and then we select any one of these. We can modify attributes. So we have identity and type up here, we have some documentation, here we have the class information and stuff, here we can modify the stuff like the text, the font, alignment, number of lines. These are the basic properties here. If we go to the ruler, here's margins and size, and so on and so forth. So here we can recognize gestures and stuff like this. Okay, so we can modify stuff directly from the attributes if we like, but this only modifies it once it's set up. Okay, so once it's already set up and the app is running, unless we specifically write code to handle certain situations, we can't modify any of the attributes. Okay, so that's why it's important to be able to add it directly to the viewController.swift so that we can modify stuff depending on the outcomes of certain tests, and when certain things happen we can change the text and stuff like that. So the way we add it in is we simply right click it, the blue line extending out here. Well, this signifies where we're going to place it. Okay, so we can place it here or as kind of like a global variable, and I'm just going to do that. I'm going to place it as a global variable, so once I release it, then we get this little window popping up that prompts us to do a few things. Okay, so there's outlet here, it's an object, it's a view controller object, it's a type UI label, and weak storage. Okay, so we can change this to from strong to weak or vice versa. We can change this from outlet to outlet collection. It's a view controller object, this is something that we can't change. And type UI label, that's also something that we can't change. Okay, so let's give this a name. Let's call this just something like LBL label. Okay, and the reason I include this 3-letter abbreviation is this kind of helps me to recognize exactly what this is at a very quick glance. So there are going to be many different views, many different objects that we can add. So for example, there's all of these. I can't scroll right now because this window's open. But what if it was a button or kind of like a text input field? Well, I might not know at a glance exactly what it is. And just having this 3-letter abbreviation helps me to determine exactly what kind of element it is. So for example, for buttons, I might use BTN. For text fields, I might use something like TXT. And again, that just helps me quickly recognize what it is. Although we've named this label, so it's pretty obvious what it is, we might not necessarily name this something so obvious, because these names should kind of be indicative of what they're doing. So for example, if this label was some kind of like a greeting text, I might name this LBL greeting text or something. Okay, for the purpose of this tutorial, we're not getting too complicated, so I'm just going to leave this as label. But feel free to name this however you want. And if we press connect, it adds it in here. Okay, so I'm just going to separate those with a space. And this is what it's added, this line here. So at IB outlet, weak variable, LBL label, UI label. So what does this all mean? Well, this means that it is a weak variable and it's called the LBL label. So this is the name we've given it, and it's of type UI label. Okay, so all of these kind of objects that we can add are UI objects. They're going to be UI something. for example, UI button, UI text field, and this one's a UI label. The exclamation mark means that we've kind of unwrapped this optional object, because otherwise it automatically defaults to contain the value nil. With this object being unwrapped using this exclamation mark, this kind of makes it no longer an optional object. Okay, so now we've added it to the code, we can access it directly by calling its name. Okay, so in the view.did_load, I'm just going to show you an example of that. I'm just going to create some space there, and so if we call LBL label, then as you can see it shows up from our list of possible objects to choose from. So if we just select it, then we know it's showing up, we know it exists, and it's giving us an error right now because we haven't kind of done anything with it. Okay, so we know we can call on it by its name. Now, what if we want to modify contents? Well, the way we do that is we call it by name and then press dot, and then it gives us this huge list of possible things that we can do. So this is a list of various objects, or various items. So there's stuff like methods where we can call methods on this LBL label, or there's just kind of attributes, so views that we can change, such as the description, fonts, this kind of is enabled, stuff like this, okay? So if you add the period in there, it just kind of gives us this list of possible things that we can do with this label, okay? And so yeah, that's basically how you add it to the code. Remember, you just select it, drag and drop, okay? And it gives you this line, and then this allows you to modify it directly from the code. Now, some IDEs, I was working with Xamarin a while ago, and we did a bunch of tutorials on Xamarin as well. This was an unnecessary step. We didn't have to drag and drop. We could just kind of call it by name, and it would automatically be initialized. Unfortunately, in Xcode, we have to perform this one extra step, which is not a whole lot of work, but just bear in mind, if you want to be able to modify the attributes of any kind of UI element you add, you have to do this drag and drop thing and add it to the code this way. And I think the easiest way to do this is by doing the show assistant editor so that you get the source code and the emulator side by side. Okay, so I'm going to just get rid of, I'm just going to get rid of this for now. And in this next part coming up, we're going to show you some of the actual modifications we can do. So this part coming up in particular, this next part, we'll be focusing on the text attributes and stuff we can do with that. So now we have our label set up to be used in the code, and this way we can actually call its name and modify certain elements in the code itself. So we initialized our label first by dragging it and dropping it from the main.storyboard, so the layout. We dragged and dropped it right into the code itself, into the viewController.swift, and we were prompted to give it a name, so we did. And so that basically just initializes a label to contain that name and also unwraps it. So this then allows us to kind of modify the properties directly in the code by calling the name of our label, which we said was LBL label. And then if we call the LBL label dot, and then it shows you that big drop down list of properties that we can modify. Okay, so this part coming up, we are going to look at some of the properties that you can modify, such as the text properties.